Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, good midnight, whatever time it might be when you're watching this. I am glad that you've tuned in to Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church's Sunday School. This is the last book in the Bible and the last session of this particular Sunday School. We have gone through, given a bird's eye view of every book of the Bible. And if you have watched more than half of them, you deserve a medal. I really am thankful for that. Most of them, or all of them, I think, are on YouTube. So if you want to see what I said about the book of Ezekiel, it should be on there. But this is the last book of the Bible. There will be some good news and some bad news. The good news is this is the last book of the Bible. The bad news is I'm not going to tell you what's going to happen tomorrow. So, and much of what I'm going to say about Revelation may go against some of the other things that you've heard, so just keep that in mind. I'm not a heretic or anything, I just take a little different, I'll present a little different view. So, here's our ever-present cartoon, a person looking through the curtain at coming events. The key word for Revelation is, in some sense, coming events. Now, you don't want to think that this is telling us things that are going to be in the newspaper today. And you don't want to think that this is giving us some kind of a clue as to exactly when the world is going to end. People have been saying that sort of thing for years and years and years, hundreds, if not thousands of years, and every one of them has been wrong. So there's no sense in which this is telling us what's going to happen. It's telling us what's ultimately going to happen, but we don't know when. And anyone who tells you that they do know when is probably wrong. And I will say almost certainly wrong. There were problems in the whole issue, in the whole milieu in which John lived. And a critical issue was that believers were being threatened with death for unwillingness to submit to emperor worship. Depending upon when you think that this was written, it depends upon which emperor they were worshiping. But John is warning the church that there may be some dark and terrible days ahead, and that believers need to remain steadfast to Christ in spite of the difficulties that they face. Because ultimately they will be given a new heaven and a new earth where there will be no more death, there will be no more emperor worship, there will be no more of these sorts of things. So, someone named John wrote this book. Up until probably 150, maybe 200 years ago, virtually everyone thought it was John the Apostle who wrote the Gospel and the epistles of John. It's not quite as accepted today, but there's an interesting thing that Tertullian says about John. You remember Tertullian, one of the fathers of the church, an early church theologian. We still have his writings today. And Tertullian passes on this idea that the Apostle John was plunged unhurt into boiling oil. So what Tertullian is telling us is that John was that somehow the government apparently attempted to put John to death by putting him in boiling oil, and he remained unhurt. And as a result of that, they banished him to the Isle of Patmos. So the Isle of Patmos is here, and you can see it, perhaps. It's right there, the little tiny island of Patmos. Here on this slide, you can see these churches are the 7 churches to which John addresses the first part of the book. So it is presumed, well, we know that John was on the island of Patmos when he writes it. He says that in the first chapter. And the island of Patmos was probably 5 miles long, and it was narrow in some places. As you can see here, there's a narrow isthmus right there that was only a few hundred yards wide, and in other places the island was up to 5 miles wide. So here you can see that the island sort of it's in the shape of a letter C almost. So you can see one part of the island from another part of the island. And it's about 7 miles north to south. And its widest, it's about 5 miles, but then its narrowest, it's just a few hundred yards. And here is the way that Patmos has changed. In the 12th century, a monastery was built there. It's the monastery of St. John. It still stands there on that site. And they have a number of ancient Greek manuscripts at that monastery. And you can go there and see what purports to be the cave in which John was living when he wrote Revelation. We don't know for sure that that's really the cave, but that's what you're told if you go there. I've never had the opportunity to go there myself, but my friends have and have told me about it. And it's a very interesting kind of place to go, both the monastery and just the island itself. It's a strange place. And remember that in the first century, the sea or the ocean was the place where monsters came from. So being surrounded by the sea was being surrounded by the place where monsters came from. And that may be why John decided to fill his apocalyptic book with such monsters. It may be that John is looking out on the ocean and he remembers the sort of monsters that he has heard of. The seven-headed hydra, the variety of different kinds of beasts and monsters that occur in a variety of different apocalyptic literature. And we'll talk about what we mean by apocalyptic literature in just a minute. But before that, one of the things that has to be thought of very early on are methods for interpreting the book. How is it that we are supposed to read the book of Revelation? And I want to point out 4 different methods. There are more, but many of them are just sort of swerves on one of these major methods. So the first one that I'll talk about is the Preterist View. The Preterist View is the idea that everything in the book of Revelation has been fulfilled. And so a preterist will argue that the Son of Man has already returned and that it's not what we would expect it to be. This argues that the book has to be dated before 70 A.D. And so it's a prophecy. Much of the prophecy is about Jerusalem's fall. And Armageddon is the siege of Jerusalem. So they see the book not as predictive in some sense, but as particularly predicting just what was going to happen then in the first century. It's not a prediction of the whole history of mankind or anything like that. And so the readers are assured in that sense that they are the true Israel, in spite of the fact that they are facing significant difficulties and significant problems. They are in the true Israel. So the preterist view is, in one of the interesting portions of it, is that the beast is seen as Nero. We'll talk a little bit about the beast and the number 666 when we get to that. But that's, if anybody knows anything from the book of Revelation, they know about the beast, often called mistakenly the Antichrist. He is not the Antichrist. He is the beast, and Antichrist is spoken of not in the book of Revelation, but in John's epistles, and where he says there are many antichrists. So there's a distinction between this beast and the Antichrist. The beast is seen as Nero, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on, but that's the preterist view. And it may be shocking to you to think that there are biblical scholars who think that everything in the book of Revelation and virtually everything in the book of in the chapter Matthew 24 has already been fulfilled. But that's one of the, it's a very conservative view, and those who are preterists are evangelists for their position, and very often abrasive evangelists for it, but not everyone. Some are just gentle in arguing that their view is the right view. Next is the historist view, and this argues that the book is a prophetic forecast of the history of the church. And so it argues that the church goes on. And so they will say that the 7 letters prophesy the 7 periods of the church age. And in this view, the Antichrist is often seen, and I should have put the beast, is often seen as the Pope. But even in the Westminster Confession, the early versions of it, they will argue that the Antichrist or the beast are the same and that he is the Pope. It's certainly not the sort of thing that's in the Westminster Confession today, but it was at that point. And so the 7 letters are seen as predicting Western church history. Since this idea comes from Western scholars, it predicts the things that they are most concerned about. The next view is the Symbolic or Idealist view. And this view argues that the book is set forth by symbol. It's setting forth basic spiritual principles that govern the life of the church throughout every age of its earthly pilgrimage. This is a view that I find myself drawn to. And essentially, it says that these symbols are not related to historical events, but they portray timeless truths. So they can be seen as important to both the people who read the book of Revelation in the first century and those who are reading it now in the 21st century. One of the questions about the book of Revelation has to do with this issue of the 1,000-year millennium. And it's only mentioned once in the book of Revelation, and there are questions about precisely what the 1,000-year millennium is. In this view, the 1,000-year millennium is generally considered one of two ways. There are some who argue, and this is the position that I would be closest to, although I wouldn't call myself an all-millennialist. They argue that the millennium is now, in the sense that Christ is ruling, Satan is bound symbolically, and that he cannot stop the church from going forth. Now, there are those who would say, well, if Satan is chained up, he must have an awfully long chain because he's going around doing all kinds of evil. And the chaining is symbolic in the sense that he cannot stop the church. It's not that Satan is unable to do anything, but he cannot stop the work of the church. That's the amillennial position. The postmillennial position argues that there is no rapture, that the world gets better and better and better until finally we usher in the 1,000-year reign of Christ. This was a very popular view before the First World War. And even after the First World War, it was like, okay, we've gotten through what was considered the tribulation. That was the First World War. Now we're going to usher in the coming of Christ. Unfortunately, what happened was not the coming of Christ, but was the Second World War. So postmillennialism is not as popular as it was today. Here's a quick chart of the postmillennial view. It is that the second coming ushers in the literal 1,000-year reign of Christ, rather than the 1,000-year reign being a symbolic number and a symbolic time when the church continues to grow and when the church cannot be stopped by Satan or his workers. Next view is the extreme futurist view, or called the Dispensationalist view. This is by far the most popular view of the book of Revelation over the last 250 to 300 years. It's not been the most popular view in church history, but it's been the most popular view in the last 250 to 300 years. And it's the view that you're probably familiar with if you are in a church, any church other than perhaps a Presbyterian one or a Reformed church. This view sees that after chapter 3, that chapters 1 through 3 are written to the 7 churches. After chapter 3, the remainder of the prophecy sets the eschatological events to be fulfilled. And it predicts, and it gives predictions at the end of history. And so virtually the entire book has yet to be fulfilled. It has yet to be fulfilled because ethnic Israel has to be restored to the land. When ethnic Israel was returned to the land in 1945 or whenever it was, that was 65 maybe, that was a huge event in prophetic landscape, and people were saying, this is it. It will be one generation until the coming of Christ. And of course, it's been longer than that. And unfortunately, those people were wrong, just as everyone else has been. This view, though, has this idea that the church will be raptured to heaven before the 7-year tribulation. So often this view is called premillennialism, but what it really is pre-tribulation rapture premillennialism. So they see a 7-year period of horrible tribulation. But before that 7-year period, the church is taken out so they don't have to suffer it. There's a time of terrible, terrible, horrible times on the earth. And then at the end of that 7 years, Jesus comes back, and then he starts his millennial reign. Now, here's a chart that'll show you a little bit about what's going on there. This is not the view that I take, and I think that reading Matthew 24, it's clearer that that's not, it's in my mind at least, clear that that's not the view that Jesus took. And so we have to be very careful about accepting theology just because it's popular or just because that's what you've always known. Think things through and make sure that they are really a part of the text of Scripture before you just accept them. This is, if you went to probably 90% of Christians and asked them what the book of Revelation teaches us is next on the horizon, I would say more than 90% would say the rapture. The problem is, I'm not even sure that the rapture is taught in the New Testament. There is the going up to meet Christ in the air as he returns, but there's nothing secret about it. In this dispensational view, the rapture is secret. It's the sort of thing that you find in the Left Behind movies or the Left Behind series. You will find, planes are without pilots and cars are without drivers and trains are without engineers and everything wrecks into everything and people die. But there's also a number of people just gone from the earth. That's the secret rapture. But in the New Testament, whenever we're talking about the coming of the Lord, it's never something that's secret. It's always loud and big and huge, and everyone knows about it. Every eye sees and every ear hears. So I'm not convinced that the New Testament teaches a secret rapture, but I must tell you there are people who know more than I do who think that it does, and that's okay. There's nothing heretical about one side or the other. It's just a small thing that we differ on in terms of biblical interpretation. So let's then move on to what is called the progressive parallelism view. And this is a very, very attractive view. Essentially, it says that each of the 7 scenes of the book cover the entire period of the church age between Christ's first and second coming. So each of the 7 sort of scenes covers the period from a slightly different perspective and adds some new information, which the other scenes don't add. And so the idea here is that the 7 bowls are not different from the 7 trumpets. They're all telling the same sort of story from some different perspective. And the beast is, in this view, many antichrists. As John says, there are many antichrists who have come throughout church history, and there that will probably inevitably be a final antichrist or a final beast who hates the church. So this is a picture or a visual that will perhaps help you to understand what's going on. So you can see how the seals, they're on the same pole as the trumpets and the bowls, but the trumpets gets a little larger, the bowls gets a little larger. They're each telling the same story. The trumpets add a little bit that the seals didn't. The bowls add a little bit that neither the trumpet or the seals did. And so it's a very attractive way of looking at the book of Revelation. And by the way, it's the book of Revelation, not Revelations. Don't add an S to it, or you will show yourself as not having read the book very carefully. It's the book of the Revelation. It's the revelation of Jesus Christ. So, the author of the book we talked about a little earlier, John being boiled in oil, it was recognized, as I've said early on, as having been written by John the Apostle. It's less recognized today. Because we don't have enough time, I will just refer you to the Lexham Bible Dictionary. You can go and get this. It's a wonderful Bible dictionary. It's free. You can go to logos.com, download that Lexham Bible Dictionary, and it's well worth it. Logos is a wonderful piece of software. Now, in terms of the date of the book, there's a lot of argumentation about what's going on. There are arguments for the late date, and the late date would be like 95, 96. The emperor then would be Domitian, and the emperor that people are being forced to worship would be, of course, Domitian. In argument for this is Irenaeus' testimony. Irenaeus, both in his works and is confirmed by Jerome to have said that the book was written during the reign of Domitian. This evidence is not without its problems, and many of these problems have to do with how exactly we want to translate Irenaeus into English to mean what he exactly meant. The emperor worship in the book, this is alluded to in the book, and it's much more widespread during Domitian's reign rather than during Nero. The persecutions that happened during this time seem to fit better with this later reign of Domitian rather than Nero. Although there's evidence for empire-wide emperor worship and persecutions because of that under each of those emperors, but there's not much. The evidence is there, but there's not a lot of it. And some argue that the seven churches, the fact that they have developed into churches and fallen away, indicates a later date. You need time for the church to be planted, you need time for the church to develop, then you need time for the church to fall away. That doesn't happen in 6 months. So it has been argued that that also is for a later date, the date in the mid-90s. But there are those who argue for an earlier date. Many of these are preterists who argue that the book is predicting the downfall of the temple. And so this is during the reign of Revelation. Gentry has written a book, Before Jerusalem Fell, Kenneth Gentry, which if you're going to argue for an early date, that is at least one of the books that you have to read. And so Gentry suggests that Nero is the sixth king in Revelation 17:10, and thus this passage points very clearly, he says, to the early date of the book. I find his analysis less than convincing, but you can, I believe, find the full book in a PDF on the internet and read it if you'd like to. There are other arguments for the early date. One of them is that Jerusalem and the temple. In Revelation chapter 11, 1 and 2, there's the present tense about John seeing the temple. And the argument is that John uses the present tense about seeing the temple because it's still there. But the counter argument is that when you're seeing a vision, you can use the present tense whether or not the actual building is still there or not, whether or not things actually exist or not. So next, we need to look at what kind of a book is the book of Revelation. What is apocalyptic literature? And there are really three levels of meaning to the word apocalyptic. The first is genre. An apocalyptic book was a sort of a hidden book, and in Revelation 1:1 it's called the Apocalypse, and it's the revelation of Jesus Christ. So it's something that's hidden that's now being made clear in some sense, but you have to read it in a certain way for it to be made clear. You have to know what the animals are and what all these symbols and things are. And then there's a kind of eschatology found in these books called Apocalyptic Eschatology. And it is that the world is heading toward eventual destruction and then remaking by God. And there's a social ideology and a worldview which produces this kind of a work. And the worldview is, in essence, written by those who are the downtrodden, who feel as if the government is against them, who feel as if they're being persecuted. Those are the people who write in a piece of apocalyptic literature. And the Revelation is full of heavenly mysteries that are revealed to us. And this is an important element. And these occur usually in the form of a vision. Even in Daniel, they will occur in the form of a vision. And sometimes there's a voice. Sometimes this is seen by some person. And this is the primary characteristic of apocalyptic. There's been a great deal of work on the nature of the experience of the writer of apocalyptic. And did they really have a dream, like Daniel says, or did they really see these things? Or is this a literary technique without a genuine experience? I believe that it is a genuine experience and that John did indeed see these visions. And I think that that's the way the book was received in the early church. They didn't see this as a transparent literary fiction. They saw it as a real event, that John had seen this vision from God. There's a great deal of symbolism. Events in history are described in the guise of animals and other monsters and things like that. And some think that this symbolism was used primarily to conceal. That is, they didn't want certain readers understanding what was going on. Others think that this world of symbolism is just a world that one enters into whenever you read this kind of a book. Just like with a novel, you enter into the world that the writer has created. You enter into the world of hobbits and orcs and whatever. In Revelation, you enter into the world of beasts and monsters and bowls and trumpets and all of that. So it's argued this is a historical narration disguised as a prediction. And one of the key points is that the sins of the people, as well as the faithfulness of God, is what we must understand. That despite our own sinfulness and our own problems, God is still faithful. Apocalyptic eschatology, what kind of eschatological teaching do we find? We find a strong philosophy of history, that is that God is in charge and unfolding His plan, that nothing happens in history accidentally or without God knowing about it. Then there's an imminence, that is the idea that the end is near, and that history is about to come to its climax. Now, what does it mean for it to be near is another of the questions, of course. But there's a certainty as to God's ultimate victory. And if you were asked, what is the book of Revelation about? In a sentence, it's God wins. In the end, God wins. Everything else is secondary to that. And then there's all kinds of apocalyptic language that you can see as you read it. The number of the beast, 666 in John 13, gives the number of the beast as 666, or in some textual variants, 616. There have been those who argue that this is a symbolic way of stating Nero. And I'll point you to Ken Gentry's book to read that in full argument if you'd like to. What is the dominant theme of the book? It is that God wins. And in the end, that's ultimately what the book is all about. What kind of Christology do we find in the book? A very, very high Christology, very high, perhaps higher than any other book of the New Testament, or at least as high. Christ is called the Alpha and the Omega at the beginning of the book and at the end of the book. In Revelation 1:8, He says, I am the Alpha and the Omega, says the Lord God, the one who is and who was and who is still to come, the all-powerful. That is Christ. And He is the one who is and who was and who is to come and who is the all-powerful. Then at the end of the book, He also said to me, it is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, the one who is thirsty. I give water free of charge from the spring of the water of life. The Alpha and Omega, of course, the Greek alphabet begins with Alpha, ends with Omega. So He is saying, I am the first and the last, the forever. And so this book's title is The Revelation of Jesus Christ. That's the primary focus of the book, the revelation of Jesus Christ. And Christ is a lamb in the book. In a number of places here, you can see the large number of times that the word lamb is used. And it's used more than any other book in the New Testament. And the lamb is the Lamb of God. Christ is the only one who can open the scroll in Revelation. He is the lamb who takes our place. In Revelation 5, there is a scroll that no one can open. And there's weeping in heaven because no one is able to open the scroll. And then John looked, and I heard around the throne the living creatures of the elders and the voice of many angels, numbering myriads and myriads and thousands, saying with a loud voice, "Worthy is the Lamb who was slain to receive power and wealth and wisdom and might and honor and glory and blessing." And so we end our study together on what the Bible is all about with a great and wonderful message that we worship the Lamb of God who is worthy to receive wealth, wisdom, might, honor, glory, and blessing. Everyone needs a lamb, and that lamb is Jesus Christ. Thanks so much for watching. I hope that this series on what the Bible is all about has been a blessing to you, and I pray that it will continue to bless those who watch it. I'm Sam Lamerson. This is Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church, and the Lord bless you as we come back together sometime in the fall for real getting together Sunday school. Thanks so much.